Hello, I'm Georgina Rose, and welcome back to the Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. And this video is part of my ongoing Occult 101 series. Occult 101 is the flagship series of this channel. I've been doing it for years, and it's basically where I give beginner introductions to esoteric topics. So you can watch the video and then jump off into further research and really get a sort of base understanding of a topic. And in this video, this is something I've wanted to talk about for a while and something that deeply influences me, and that is Platonic paganism or Platonist polytheism, Platonic polytheism. You can call it a number of things, but basically it's pagan or polytheistic religions that are heavily influenced by Platonic philosophy, theology, and thought. And this is a very, very ancient and traditional way of being a pagan. In fact, this was very, very popular in the ancient Hellenic world. And it's actually kind of a trendy sort of ideology right now. It's really gained a lot of steam over the past few years. Obviously, paganism on the whole is on the rise, right? It's the largest and fastest growing religion in the United States. Of course, it's not the largest religion overall, but in terms of, growing religions, paganism is huge. A lot of people are considering these ideas. And for a lot of people considering these ideas, they want to go back to the source, back to the originator. And for a lot of people, that is Platonic polytheism. There have actually been two books in recent years that are released on the subject, one by Steve Dillian and one by Eric Clausen. I love the Eric Clausen book. It really impacted me, and I think it's great and would highly recommend it. I'll put the name in the description. But regardless, very important movement. And what people also don't know is that Platonic polytheism is actually the basis of a lot of Western esotericism. Western esotericism is a term for the Western mystery tradition, or the occult. And there is none of that without Platonism. Plato is sort of the father of all of Western thought, whether that's philosophy, politics, and yes, occultism. People have sort of, misunderstood Plato. They see Plato as like the guy with the cave allegory, the guy who wrote the Republic. And a lot of people don't even consider that his work is deeply religious, because within Platonic thought, everything is connected. So everything actually links together. And there is a deep metaphysical core. And if you believe any sort of Western occult idea, whether it's pagan or whether it's just, mystic, even if you're a Christian or a Muslim interested in mysticism, you are impacted by Platonism. So let's get into it. So Platonism obviously originates from the philosopher Plato. He is sort of the mind behind it. But we cannot forget that Platonism is also a school of thought. There are not just thinkers like him. Specifically, Plotinus, or sort of the father of Neoplatonism, or later Platonism in a lot of people's minds, is another influence. So we're not just looking at Plato, but of course Plato is the source. And anyone who becomes a Platonist should read Plato, obviously. Now, what did he think? So I think it's worth looking at his core metaphysical idea, because that really gives us a place to move on from. And the core of Platonic metaphysics is the idea of monism, or one-ism, right? Mon means one. So what does that mean? So basically a lot of religions have the idea of all is one. That originates from Platonic thought, meaning that this idea is a perennial truth and is accepted by most Perennialists. Now, how does that work in practice, and what on earth do I mean when I call that paganism? So a lot of Christians actually think that Plato was the first Christian. This obviously makes no sense because Christ did not exist at the time and Plato was not a follower of Jewish religion. And he was a polytheist. So how are we squaring monism, or all is one, the idea that everything is part of the one, that everything is connected, everything is part of one singular higher being, and polytheism? That seems really contradictory. And there's a distinction made by modern neo-pagans that I think explains this really well. So within modern neo-paganism, there is a division. There is soft polytheism and there is hard polytheism. So soft polytheism is the belief that all of the gods are part of one emanatory force that goes throughout all. They are kind of faces of one thing. If you've ever learned about Hinduism, you would know that Hinduism basically has the theology. If you've ever been a Wiccan, you would know that there is a god and a goddess, but of course people call on all sorts of different names of gods and goddesses. But what are they? They're all faces of that same energy. So essentially it just means that, yeah, these are distinct gods, but they are all one thing. But then that raises the question, why would you not just worship it as one god? The reason why you don't worship it as one god is that once you're at the point where you have, just the source of all of one, it's not actually formed into anything, right? There's no distinction, right? Because the gods, with the named gods that people worship, that's the first form of distinction that comes out of the one. So if everything is one, we understand, and I just want to give a practical example in a material sense to help people understand, because obviously as above, so below is a Platonic idea, right? Because all is one. You see a lot of core occult ideas are coming from this, right? So you and I are two different people, right? Me, you. We understand they are separate. And look outside. I look out my window, I see a mountain, I see a tree. Those are obviously distinct. I still call them mountain and tree. But if I accept Platonic thought, which I do, I understand that all is one. So if all is one, why wouldn't I just say everything is Georgina Rose, right? That's Georgina Rose, that's Georgina Rose, that's Georgina Rose, you're Georgina Rose. Obviously, I wouldn't, right? Everything is one in a metaphysical sense, and in a higher abstract sense, it's all part of one oneness, but there's still distinction, there's still separation, right? There is no separation, but there is separation. Within a lot of metaphysical thoughts, you see these seeming contradictions, but then you think about it and it makes sense. Like, yeah, you and I are different people, but we are part of the same collective consciousness. We are part of the same one singular energy at the end of the day, but of course we still honor those distinctions. And that's why soft polytheism is polytheistic. And a lot of Christians who say this is proto-Christian thinking, I consider what would happen if I walked into a Catholic church right now and I started praying at the shrine and I was like, Mary, also known as Hecate, also known as, the Morrigan, right? I think they would kick me out. They would have some questions. Justifiably. That's not Christian theology, right? That's not what Christians think, but it is kind of a Platonic stance. And I will give it this. Platonism did heavily influence Christian thinking, and it is likely that a lot of Christian esotericism would not exist without Platonism. But Platonism itself is polytheistic. Plato honored multiple gods, and his theology clearly comes from Hellenic thought, not later monotheistic thought. Now, hard polytheism is what a lot of people assume paganism is. Hard polytheism is the idea that all gods are completely distinct and separate. Now, there are specific traditions that do believe this. I find, this does appear to be the most common with Nordic pagans. That seems to be the group that is the most hard polytheistic, but there are other people who are hard polytheists. I'm not saying that's a Nordic pagan thing, and I also am not saying all Nordic pagans are hard polytheists. That just seems to be the group that adopts this the most. But historically, a lot of pagans were soft polytheists. This is not some later metaphysical concept that people have come up with. It's what Plato was saying, and Plato lived a very, very long time ago. I think we all know that. So that was Plato's idea. Yeah, it's monism, all is one, but there is still separation, so you still honor the gods, right? And the one is, of course, the highest good, the highest, creation, the highest being of things, right? So your goal is to get close to the one, right? To unify. And they use this term ascesis or ascesis. I really am bad at my pronunciation, which is basically unity with the Godhead. If you're familiar with later metaphysics, think of the term theosis. So theosis is a term used in Orthodox Christian mysticism that basically refers to uniting wholly with God. So theosis is a downstream idea of ancient Platonic thought. People are more familiar with theosis, so I'm using it to explain the ancient thought because that is a derivative idea of the earlier thing. Now, if you think about Buddhism, we understand that the highest goal of Buddhism is to escape samsara, the wheel behind me, the current cycle of life, death, and rebirth, and achieve enlightenment and nirvana and unite once again and break out of this cycle. Same kind of goal, right? So your goal is ascesis. Now, how do you get there? So Platonism is actually very anti-Gnostic because when people think of like, I want to unite with the one, I want to escape this reality by uniting with God, they actually often go down a kind of Gnostic trail of thinking. So Gnosticism is an esoteric idea that basically posits that this world was created by a false god known as the demiurge, right? That the demiurge created this material prison where everything sucks, nothing's divine, right? And so your goal is to break beyond this material prison and achieve gnosis or knowledge and then reunite with the Christ Sophia or, the true God or whatever you want to call it, right? And there are some people who have kind of taken Plato's monism, one idea, and applied it to Gnosticism, but I want to be very clear that Platonism proper and people who call themselves Platonist pagans are in a sense anti-Gnostic. A lot of the first metaphysical attacks on Gnosticism specifically were written by Plotinus, a Platonist, right? Platonism actually posits that the one is good, right? Because the idea of forms is a big part of Platonic philosophy all around. And this applies to their divine and metaphysical philosophy, right? And basically, goodness exists, love exists, beauty exists, art exists. These things are objective forms that exist. And they are created by the Godhead or the gods, right? So you are actually seeing that creator being as good and its creation is good because all is one. So the material world is actually good from a Platonic pagan perspective. This is not an anti-material perspective where you're trying to break beyond this world and unite with the Godhead because this world is evil. No, you are trying to unite with the Godhead because the gods are good and becoming even more good. So by becoming even more good, you've achieved the ultimate goal, right? So it's pro-material. This is a pro-material philosophy. And I'm not going to deny that Platonism has influenced Gnosticism. I do believe that's why Plotinus was such an attacker of Gnosticism, is because they see the parallel and they go, no, that's not what we're saying, right? So Platonist pagans see the world as good and see things like connecting with nature and whatnot as a good way to transcend and get closer to the one. Now, what does this look like in practice? What metaphysics are we doing, right? What magic are we doing, right? Because I'm an occultism, driven channel, right? I'm all about mysticism. I'm all about, practical things. So how do you actually follow a Platonic pagan path? What does it mean to be a Platonic pagan? What is the life, right? So what do you do? So the big thing with Platonic paganism is it is a system about purification. Since your goal is uniting with the Godhead and uniting with the One and transcending this world, right? By uniting with the highest form of this world, your goal is going to be purification. So there is a term in, ancient Greek metaphysical mystic philosophy called theurgy or theurgia. So theurgy is a term for divine magic of the gods. A lot of theurgical techniques we would call mysticism in the modern mind. That means things like invocation, prayers, offerings, that type of stuff. Not really practical results magic, right? Platonic paganism doesn't really lend itself to practical results magic, not really to witchcraft. And actually Plato heavily criticized these practices and called it superstitio or superstition, right? He didn't like folk magic. He had a problem with it. He thought it was superstitious. So that's kind of out of the Platonic pagan worldview. Now, you can believe in Platonic metaphysics and practice these things. It's not necessarily, something that's going to give you like a negative result, but that's not really like the goal, right? Platonic paganism is about higher aims and higher goals and uniting with the One and uniting with the Godhead. And so what you do is you purify yourself and you become virtuous. Those are the two main Platonic pagan goals, right? So there's an ancient idea called miasma or spiritual pollution. And I talked quite a bit about miasma. I think it's a fascinating theory. There's kind of two types of miasma, greater miasma and lesser miasma. So lesser miasma, you accrue it throughout the day, right? You get dirty, you pick up the things around you, you get your moods, right? And then greater miasma is basically things that go against the law of the gods, right? Things that are big moral violations, like say committing murder or incest, or even, just being around death, right? Like after, warriors came back from Sparta, they had to be purified of greater miasma because they were surrounded by death and destruction. So undoing your miasma is going to be a big part of Platonic pagan practice, right? Identifying where your miasma is and then working through it is going to be major. And then you're going to want to purify yourself. So you're going to want to become more pure, and the way that paganism within the Platonic framework does this is through virtue. So virtue is an idea, once again, people associate with Christianity, but it has ancient pagan roots. In fact, the entire concept of virtue ethics, or what is virtuous being good and ethics being based around a concept of virtue, comes from Platonic paganism. So by embodying virtue, you are getting closer to the Godhead and you're getting closer to the gods. So there's a bunch of different virtues within Plato's thinking. There's civic virtues, there's personal virtues. So by being a more virtuous individual and creating a more virtuous society, you are able to get closer to the Godhead. There's many, many ways you can embody virtue, right? That's material things, that's personal changes. And as you do that, you become more purified and closer to the Godhead. So it's just a gradual process upwards. Theurgy can be a big part of this. So theurgy is, of course, mysticism or divine magic of the gods. I find common gods that Platonic pagans tend to work with are solar gods and Jupiterian gods. Typically gods associated with the benefics or sort of things that add. But when you are getting rid of your miasma, working with more malefic energies or energies that take away could be completely helpful in that process. I think catharsis work could be very valuable for someone on a Platonic pagan path. Catharsis work is basically having releases of miasma to purify you. So certain, ancient rituals I could see being very much incorporated into a Platonic pagan path. There's an ancient ritual that actually comes from ancient Greece, from the Greek magical papyri, which is a text of a lot of, ancient rituals and spells that we have, called the headless ritual. The headless ritual is a exorcism or purificatory rite. People use it now ahead of evocations, but people in the ancient world used it to cleanse themselves of everything around them. I see the headless ritual as a big thing you could incorporate into a Platonic pagan, practice and lifestyle. So really you're centering virtue, you're centering getting rid of miasma, and these are your core ideas. And if we're going to stay traditional to what Plato said, this does need to be remained within a pagan framework, right? Within worshiping the pagan gods. But obviously these ideas did not become contained, because if you are familiar with any sort of mystic or esoteric path, you're probably seeing a lot of connections in your head. And that's because Platonism is a foundation, right? It's really hard to not be a Platonist to some extent and live in the Western world. He's a key Western philosopher. I don't think there's many people who aren't Platonist to some extent. In fact, Neoplatonism, or later Platonism, essentially, is the basis of ideas like Hermeticism, of, modern Western esoteric thought. Like when we're looking at magical revival traditions like Wicca, Thelema, Golden Dawn style Hermeticism, there's a heavy dose of Neoplatonism in there. In fact, we see all these diagrams in mystic thought. People love diagrams, right? Like where it's like the source here and then this and this and this, right? These like flowchart things where it's like a triangle. The most famous would of course would be the Tree of Life, but there's 8 million versions of it, right? There's 90 million diagrams. We love diagrams in the esoteric community. All of those are downstream of Platonism, okay? The entire idea of emanationism, or the idea that everything begins at one point and then emanates through all things, that's an elaboration on Plato's thoughts. So there's been a lot of elaborations on Plato's thoughts over the years. And in fact, a large chunk of Christian mysticism and a large chunk of Sufi mysticism even has a big dose of Platonism going into it. And when we look at older esoteric grimoires from the grimoire tradition, I'm talking Arbitel, PGM, obviously, and a lot of those older ones, there's a heavy dose of Platonism in there, right? It's really embedded deep in the DNA of modern esotericism. It's kind of hard to pull it out. So Platonism, you can see it as the grandfather of traditions. And if you're going to be a Platonic pagan, obviously, Neoplatonism and ideas influenced by Platonism would be irrelevant to you. But I think for people who are not, trying to reconstruct ancient Platonic paganism, looking at those ideas could be interesting as well. But I think it's worth remembering where it comes from. And I think when people do start saying that Platonism is a Christian thing, or Plato was the first Christian, it's worth counter-signaling that, because that's not the truth, and we shouldn't be spreading lies on the internet as much as people love to spread lies on the internet. There's a lot that comes out of Platonic paganism. And when I look at people who are becoming Platonic pagans, I think it's really worth emphasizing that it should be more than just philosophy, right? Because philosophy is a big part of Platonic paganism, and I think people think of philosophy as a passive act. There's this term we use in the occult community called armchair magician. It's a bit of an insult. It's basically for the person who sits in their armchair all day and has a beautiful collection of occult books, who has literally never done a ritual in their entire life. They've never done an initiation. They've never flipped a tarot card. They just read, right? Within Platonic paganism, reading philosophy is actually considered part of the path, because contemplating and gaining gnosis is a virtue, and so you are getting closer, to the gods by doing that. So, philosophy itself has a place, right? Because the thing with Platonism that I think is a bit incongruent with modern thinking, even though modern thinking is so influenced by Platonism, is the idea that Platonism believes in the one to such an extent that there is no separation, that all of your actions have mystic impacts. That's why you've emphasized the virtue thing, right? Because by studying, by becoming more wise, that's a virtue. So everything virtuous you do is actually making progress within Platonic paganism. I still stress a personal spiritual practice, because I don't think you can continue and finish that work that Platonic paganism asks of all its devotees to do without that practical side, without theurgy, without doing the purificatory work, without going through those periods of time, and choosing, a more purification-based lifestyle. Of course, we know various purification techniques that you can do are about diet and dress and, things you're around and whatnot. All of that, all Platonic pagans should really look into. But we also need to consider that literally everything is mystical within the Platonic system, because all is one is taken to its furthest extent, right? So all your actions need to be considered. And I would recommend anyone on the Platonic pagan path to have a really, robust contemplation practice, because this is a system that literally says everything goes into it, right? All of your actions need to be considered. Like there's nothing that is not mystical. There's nothing that is not affecting your virtue and your ability to get close to the gods. So you need to be just hyper vigilant. And I also think it's worth exploring, people who want to combine Platonism with other ideas. Like for me, of course, I'm not a straight Platonist. I'm influenced by Platonism. That's why I actually say I'm a Neoplatonist and not a traditional Platonist when people ask. I do think it's okay to combine with it, but I think it's worth remembering the source and remembering the core ideas. Like, of course, I believe in true will. True will is not really a Platonic pagan idea, but I think it is completely congruent, so I bring it together. One of the problems with, later Platonism is people started combining Platonism with things like, because a lot of these ideas are pretty universal, right? They're perennial truths. They started combining it with things that it didn't mean, right? Like the big association between Platonism and monotheism. When I've explained, it's not monotheism, it's emanationism, right? You start getting some incongruencies, and I really think when people are, bringing Platonism and other philosophies, they should really consider where things clash and try to work that out, right? Because the thing with syncretism is okay as long as things don't start clashing, but once things start clashing, it ceases to make sense and you don't have a coherent practice, right? This is one of my big, criticisms of chaos magic, right? Chaos magic is, high-level syncretism, is constant syncretism, right? And if things work together, I do think syncretism is okay, but too much of it, it's gonna cease to make any sense. Like why are you worshiping gods that have a problem problem with each other. Like, why are you a monotheist and a polytheist? Like what's happening here, right? So with Platonism, I think especially as you get into Neoplatonism and non-traditional Platonism, you run a risk of getting into like syncretism chaos, where like you're doing a lot of things that don't make sense together. So I do think you should be really mindful of that if you go deep into Neoplatonic thought, because once again, Platonism is sort of the base of everything, which means it can be applied in so many different ways. But I think it's also worth remembering, just because Platonism is the base of everything, it doesn't mean that traditional Platonism doesn't have a clear structure, right? Traditional Platonic paganism is very, very clear on what it is. There's specific gods that are worshipped the most, right? A lot of these people have a huge, devotion to Jupiter and Zeus because he's the king of the gods, right? And so when you're trying to get right with your miasma and, get right with the gods, the epithet that is used in cathartic rites to eliminate miasma is Zeus Catharsios, or the catharsis epithet of Zeus, right? So if you're going down this ascesis path that goes with Platonic paganism, you really do want to be focusing on those deities, right? So if you're taking a traditional approach, you really do have to have traditional parameters within your Platonic practice, or things do start to go haywire. So I think it's worth looking into that. And I would also say anyone who's a Platonic pagan should spend a lot of time studying theurgy, right? If you're going traditional, theurgy is going to be a big part of your life, and it's worth seriously considering how to incorporate theurgy into your life and how to bring that together. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the core of Platonic paganism. I think it's cool that it's trendy. I think it's cool that it's coming back. I think it's a great system, and I think, it is a bit more structured than some other pagan systems. I think a lot of people yearn for structure, and one of the big problems with the pagan community is a lot of systems are not structured, and this does give structure. I think for people who are, big Platonist pagans, it's a bit of a tongue twister, starting organizations could be really good, because I think giving people like, a temple system or an initiatory system would be an awesome way to sort of spread those ideas and make it a bit more robust. So just recommendation to people who are working on that, like creating, an initiatory system for Platonist paganism would be awesome, and totally in line with what Plato said. You guys should just do that. I'm giving that idea out in the world. Don't credit me. I want to see it happen. Manifesting, right? So yeah, that's all I have to say. I'm viewer supported. If you want to support this channel, please join my Patreon. You get a bonus video every month. You get ritual guides every month, and you get early access to every single video. And if you're a high enough tier, you get herbal preparations sent to your house every month, and you get mentorship sessions one-on-one with me, where I give you direct spiritual advice for your situation. I also am a professional tarot reader and astrologer. I do traditional natal astrology and planetary remediation-based readings, as well as any sort of tarot reading you want. I do all tarot, whatever you request is fine. And I also host the podcast Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. You can find that on this YouTube channel and on most podcasting platforms under Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. I am a Substack blogger. You can go to my Substack. I do occasional features in other magazines. Those are always linked on my Substack for when I write for other places. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all I do. I'm also on Instagram, TikTok. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much everywhere. There's not a big place I'm not. Oh, and I'm on Twitter/X, whatever you want to call that. So yeah, I'm everywhere, and I upload here every Wednesday. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you're subscribed for 93 days and you listen to this point, you will meet your holy guardian angel, and you'll never need to be a Platonist again. All right, bye!